It's been a long, hard journey for decades, even centuries, moving forward in women's empowerment. Now, we may be approaching a tipping point in business, in government, and in other institutions around the world.
This is a co-presentation by PRIME, Principles for Responsible Management Education and Business in Society.
Welcome to Business in Society. I'm John Palusek, your host. We're reporting today from the United Nations Global Headquarters in New York, where a major conference on women's empowerment is about to get underway. This is a conference that has drawn some 250 leaders in the movement to talk about gender equality and the global jobs challenge. Some 670 CEOs from around the world have endorsed these principles. We'll be talking to three of the leaders here at the conference in terms of how women can advance their personal and professional objectives. There's plenty to do, and not just women will be doing it. I'm pleased to welcome to the program Dr. Anne Marie Slaughter, the president of the New America Foundation and the keynote speaker today at the Women's Empowerment Principles event here at the UN. Dr. Slaughter, there has been so much done on women's empowerment, and there's so much more to be done. How do we draw a bottom line on that? We've seen these great advances in terms of the CEOs at IBM and GM and the defense contractors, et cetera. And yet there seems to be some sort of stasis, some sort of settling, as it were, at the moment. Just where are we?
Well, we've had about 10 to 15% women in leadership positions for the last 2 decades. We are stuck. I mean, for all the firsts, and they are great firsts, you know, the first woman president of GM, the first woman president of Lockheed, those are wonderful, but they don't change the overall numbers. So you have roughly 30 women out of the Fortune 500 CEOs in the United States, and that's relatively high, obviously, for many countries. We still need to address one of the most fundamental questions in developed countries, which is how on earth you could possibly have women doing full-time leadership jobs, 24/7 jobs, travel around the world jobs, without a lead parent at home. We do not expect men to do that job without a lead parent at home. There's really no way, if we're going to get to anything approaching parity, that we're going to have women do that without their partners, husbands, being lead parent. Doesn't mean they can't work, but it means somebody's got to be lead parent, lead caregiver. So that's the first thing in developed countries. In developing countries, again, there's a tremendous amount we still need to do in terms of opening opportunities for women, but a lot of those opportunities are not going to be open for women unless we also change norms and opportunities for men.
What is the role for an organization like the New America Foundation and civil society, the NGOs? Can there be thrust and stimulus from that sector?
Absolutely. And so an organization like the United Nations is just a superb global focal point. The women's empowerment principles provide that framework, and they provide people signing on and agreeing, you know, what is desirable. It is up to national governments, corporations, and definitely civil society to translate those principles into action in a whole range of ways.
And specifically, the New America Foundation is moving in that direction as well?
We are. A New America, which is really what I call a civic enterprise. We don't give money. We're not that kind of a foundation. We are an entity that combines a think tank, a technology laboratory, and field work. And what we're doing in this space, we have a new program called Breadwinning and Caregiving, which recognizes the basic point that all human beings are both breadwinners at some point in their lives and caregivers at various points in their lives. And the question for women, but equally for men, is how do you balance those two things? And in many parts of the United States, women are now the primary breadwinners in their families. And the question then is, so what does that mean for men who are earning a living but also need to take a bigger caregiving role?
So is this a matter of culture? Is this a matter of sociology? it seems like it's been developing nicely for some time, but as you say, it seems to have slowed down or perhaps even become somewhat stabilized. What are the barriers? What has to happen to make this move forward?
Well, a lot of it is cultural. We have done a lot in the law. We have more to do. I mean, only in the last 5 years, for instance, did Congress pass the Lilly Ledbetter Act, where equal pay for equal work. There are still all over the world women getting paid less for equal work. So there's more to do in the legal area. There's more to do in policy change. But culture is essential. And in my lifetime, we've gone from the idea that a woman's place was in the home to a girl who was competitive, would never get a husband, to instead seeing women, everything from being Olympic athletes to being leaders in all sorts of ways, and yet still being able to be fully women. My proposition is the next phase has to change a lot of those norms around men, because we've gone just about as far as we can go with women trying to do all the work Dad used to do and the work Mom used to do. We need to actually find ourselves in a situation where men and women are both caregivers and breadwinners. But I think this is still a big change for many men. It's one thing to say, yes, of course, we believe in equality for men and women. It's another to actually then say, well, wait a minute, that means if I marry a woman who's in the workforce, will I defer my promotion so she can take one? Will I stay home for a while so that she can be in a job that allows her to travel? The real choices of equality require bigger trade-offs than I think many men traditionally have been willing to make.
And sometimes it's a matter of, will I move with my spouse
Absolutely.
to another locale because she has a wonderful opportunity?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, that's all part of it.
Yeah. Well, but men, in terms of sociology, you were talking about how we socialize people.
Yeah.
Men are still socialized to believe their self-worth comes almost entirely from how well they can support their family, how much money they earn, how much they advance in their careers. So, to say to a guy, you're supporting your family if you're willing to move and defer something that would otherwise happen in your career, that's as big a change as the change women have gone through in the past decades, thinking I can be a woman, I can be a caregiver, and I can be a CEO too.
I have to ask you briefly about your iconic article in Atlantic.
Yes.
Okay? And perhaps the way to get at that is to point out that in her autobiography, Justice Sotomayor says this: as for the possibility of having it all, career and family, with no sacrifices for either, that is a myth we would do well to abandon, together with the pernicious notion that a woman who chooses one or the other is somehow deficient.
I love that.
You buy it?
I do. Yes, it's interesting. Justice Sotomayor and I had a conversation on this front when I first became dean at Princeton. I was the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, and I remember her saying something like this to me, and at that point, I was in my early 40s, and I said, oh, come on, of course we can have it all. A decade later, I wrote an article saying, actually, you can make it work. You can fit together work and family if you're wealthy, if you have a job that allows you to control your own time, and if you're fairly superhuman and organized. But overall, I agree with her much more. I don't think women or men can actually, have a career full out and also be a primary caregiver. Something's going to give in the majority of cases. But what she's saying is her choice not to have children should be just as much respected, and she's just as complete a woman as if she had either decided to be a full-time caregiver or if she'd combined it in some way. And I agree with that too.
Yeah. Barbara Krumsiek said, having it all is what you think having it all should be.
I think that's right. I think that's right. Although I do think we need to, what we're aiming for, the having it all debate was simply to say we want really equal choices between men and women. So if a man can have a career as a leader and also have a family, we should make that set of choices equally open to women.
But things are changing rapidly enough? you think?
They're changing. The world we live in now was unimaginable to me growing up in Virginia in the 60s and 70s. So things are definitely changing. My proposition, though, and I think the reason you need UN Women, the reason you need women's empowerment principles, is we're about midway through the full gender revolution.
Are there heroes or heroines in this effort?
Oh, there are many. There are many. And many heroes. I mean, I would never have had the career I've had but for male mentors who were dedicated feminists. So the men who opened the doors and who supported feminism in multiple countries are certainly heroes. They're less recognized than people say, like my old boss Hillary Clinton, who is, a heroine to women all around the world. Mary Robinson, Angela Merkel. I mean, there's so many women who have broken through those glass ceilings and inspired new generations of women. Again, I would say they're heroines. I'd like to see us honoring an equal number of male heroes who make room for women and who change their own view of what it means to be a man.
Well, hopefully that's coming. I have another quote here, and perhaps you'll recognize it. The most convincing argument for our way of life will lie in our ability to make it possible for more and more people to realize their American dreams. Do you recognize that? The author, Dr. Anne Marie Slaughter, in The Idea is America in 2007. And it strikes me that thought, making it possible for more and more people, women, to realize their dreams in America, is relevant to what we're talking about. Buy that?
I do. So I think in that, what I was trying to say there was, the United States needs to live up to its own values. The best thing we can do in the world is to live up to what we say we stand for, and I do think that's relevant. Actually, on gender issues, we've done pretty well. We actually are a country for all of our faults, and we don't have daycare, universally affordable daycare, and we don't have paid maternity leave. We're one of 4 countries in the world, and the other 3 are Lesotho, Swaziland, and Papua New Guinea, who do not have paid maternity leave. But so we've got a long way to go. But on the other hand, people look at the United States and they do see women breaking through all sorts of barriers.
So bottom line, in sum, what's the message to a young, aspiring woman who wants to move forward and achieve her personal and professional objectives?
First thing is to believe that she can do it, but to understand there are likely to be lots of trade-offs along the way, and to prepare for those. So not to just believe it's as easy as she's been raised to think it is, that there are going to be lots of trade-offs. To believe that she is going to have to engage the men in her life and ask them to make trade-offs just as much as she's going to have to make trade-offs. And I think ultimately to see this not just as a woman's issue, but as a human issue. So I would say to a young woman, you want a world in which you and the men in your life can equally be both carers and competitors, or breadwinners and caregivers.
That is an empowering message. Thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you. Joining us now is Barbara Krumsiek, CEO of Calvert Investments. Thank you very much for coming, Cal.
Thank you, John. Glad to be here.
Under your leadership, Calvert Women's Principles were created in 2004?
Correct.
The first corporate global code of conduct focusing exclusively on empowering and advancing and investing in women worldwide. Wow. How has that been implemented within Calvert, and what sort of outreach have you had with that kind of code of conduct and principles?
Well, we developed the principles really because as an investment firm focusing on corporate responsibility, environmental, social, and governance practices in companies, we always focused on gender equality as an important element of corporate success. But there were no guidelines for companies on what would constitute practices and behaviors that would affect gender equality in the workplace. It helped provide us a framework for looking at companies through a gender lens and evaluating their performance. The most obvious and measurable gender leadership issue is presence on the board of directors. So certainly we do look for and count gender inclusion on the board as an important element for an investable company. So we practice implementing the principles in our own investment practices.
Now, there is a socially responsible investing community. However, women's empowerment is important to investors even beyond that community. Is that correct?
Absolutely. We believe it should be important because it indicates quality of management. It indicates attention to talent and talent development. Gender equality indicates the importance of competitiveness in the global economy. The world's workforce is really comprised of women, by and large, and in the United States, more than 60% of college degrees are granted to women. So we believe companies, not just socially responsible investment companies, but any company that does not treat the gender issue as a true business imperative is probably leaving some performance on the table.
We've just come from your session, and you offered a number of very, very interesting comments. One of them you called the messy middle. And I'm intrigued by that because obviously there have been some wonderful accomplishments by women. I mean, we have CEOs at IBM and General Motors and Yahoo, et cetera, and yet there are these other levels of experience, involvement, aspiration, and so forth. What do you mean by the messy middle?
If we have 60% of college graduates as women entering our workforce, being at a phase in their career where meritocracy is very prevalent and entering with great enthusiasm, then we wind up with only 4.2% of CEOs of large companies are women. It's not that jump from the entry level to leadership that's the issue. It is this, what I call the messy middle. So when I think of the messy middle, I think of what happens when in the workplace it's beyond competence. It's about all the other factors that contribute to executive development and leadership success. Positive politics, managing difficult bosses, managing subversive subordinates. And women are not thriving in that middle part of a career. Now, some are making it through to the top, but I do think we need to really spend more time exploring not only what women can do when they're in mid-career and generally at a point in their lives where they're balancing many priorities and making choices in how they spend their time and how they advance their careers, but also what companies are doing to recognize that this is a unique and distinct phase of a career.
And you spoke of an interesting thing that happened at Harvard Business School in terms of how the culture had to adjust to these opportunities as well as these challenges. How did that go?
The new president of Harvard, who's a woman, and the new dean of the business school back in 2009-10 recognized that while women were entering Harvard Business School with very capable grade point averages and scores on standardized tests and achievements in their short work careers prior to business school, women were entering, say, at 30% of the class, but yet they were only graduating at about 6% of the top achievers in business school. You could ask yourself, as I've asked, just to be blunt about it, did the women get stupid? The women are coming in 50%, only reaching 4% of top leadership. What's going on? Harvard asked itself that and decided to tackle it with the class of 2012, beginning in 2010. They taped classrooms to see the interactions and the role of professors. They taped social settings to see how the women were studying and how the men were studying and how that unfolded. And when they did this, it was very, very wrenching because it's uncomfortable for a well-meaning professor to be shown how they might have had a certain bias in the classroom in terms of how they responded to responses from men and women in the room and who they called on. But yet they were coached, and the women students were coached as well to build their confidence. And lo and behold, at the end of 2012, the women graduated roughly proportionally to their level of entering the class. Dramatic.
And women's empowerment has been a long story, and there have been some great achievements. There's still much to be done, but I think you feel that we may be approaching a tipping point.
So I have said this before, but this time I really mean it. I think we're at a tipping point. And the reason I think we are is because I'm seeing for the first time all elements that can affect gender equality whether it's governments, communities, and consumers caring about the role of women in factories and in workplaces. I'm seeing company leadership adopt really as imperatives for the company to be inclusive and to conduct themselves in a way that women are given full opportunities. So I'm seeing all elements of society really aspire. Now, whether we're not there yet, because this aspiration has not translated yet into the laws that are needed in some societies in order to allow women to have the rights to work and to serve in corporate capacities and lead companies and borrow money and all the things we take for granted perhaps in some of our societies. So there's a ways to go, and certainly the UN and UN Women and the Global Compact, bringing together the women's empowerment principles within the UN family and seeking endorsements and signatories for the women's empowerment principles globally is yet another sign, and that's just been the last 4 years.
And Steve Allman, global chair of Deloitte, and Deloitte itself, stressed that there's something very special here that men should undertake, and obviously because many men are CEOs themselves, et cetera. So there's a good business reason that corporate leaders, for example, should be very receptive to these kinds of messages.
Absolutely, and we need that awareness level by CEOs, and male and female, and men in the workplace about these norms.
Is there a special sensitivity among those of us who are fathers of daughters?
Absolutely. I think the earliest progress in corporate America occurred in companies where the CEO had daughters, and I myself benefited from that in the 70s. I think that's a real plus, but there's more that's needed.
Who are your heroines or heroes in women empowerment these days, anywhere around the world? I'm
terribly admiring of any woman that is stepping out and leading, but in the corporate world, my heroines are the single moms who are struggling to be all that they need to be, and I'm very conscious of who are single moms within our company.
So bottom line, what would be the message that you'd like to deliver to perhaps the young women of today who aspire to both personal and professional achievement?
Oh, I think I would say two things. Number one, always tell your own story. Don't rely on the world knowing what your capabilities are or making assumptions about your capabilities. Because I do think for young women, there will be some blanks that the public might have or your workplace might have about women's capabilities. I personally always find a way to say I was a math major. I always work that into a conversation, which I just did. I have an advanced degree in mathematics because people don't expect that. The second thing I would say is aspire for everything you'd like in your life, personally, professionally, fun, whatever you'd aspire to, and understand that you can make your own definition of what that is and what, and at different points in time, you might emphasize different aspects of what you want out of your life and your career and your family, your community, and that's okay. There is no one formula. There is no one prescribed perfect way to be.
That's a great message. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Steve Allman, global chair of the Deloitte firm, also shared his views at the conference. Deloitte has emphasized the role of men in the women's empowerment movement. Let's hear some of Steve's thoughts.
I call on more of those 680 CEOs to take a lead, because too often responsibility is delegated to the HR department or a task force, whereas organizational change happens when a CEO takes personal responsibility for a strategic objective and sets clear targets. And of course, other stakeholders will rightly hold the CEO to account if those targets are not met.
And now for a little context on today's event and on the Women's Empowerment Principles program itself. We're joined by Ursula Wynhoven, who is the General Counsel for the United Nations Global Compact. This is quite an event. I mean, there has been
I would say, a plethora of information and insights that is going to drive women's empowerment for the foreseeable future, really. And I thought it might be interesting for you maybe to provide a little context on the program itself. I mean, there are 7 principles, there are almost 700 companies that have now endorsed it in some fashion. Where is it now, and where might it be heading in terms of women's empowerment?
And thanks for the great remarks actually about the event. We're really excited about how it's going. So the Women's Empowerment Principles, they're 7 steps for business on how to empower women and promote gender equality in the workplace, marketplace and community. And they've only been going for around 4 years actually, so the nearly 700 CEOs that you talked about are really just accumulated in that time. And it's quite exciting to see that we're nearly getting 1 more each day. So we're actually hoping that maybe even by the end of next year we could have a couple more hundred. One of the hallmark discussion topics in the last couple of days has really been about the fact that the business case is really clear, but the business case can only get us so far. And we need to combine that business case with the emotional case. And we need to look deeper at some of the attitudes and unconscious bias that is still holding us back.
And some of your speakers have been making the point that there is so much to do, of course, but it's not just women who are going to do it, that men have a role and should understand that there is a win-win situation for everybody.
Absolutely. The role of men and boys actually is absolutely critical, and we have lots of provisions in them actually that speak specifically to women and men, but you're absolutely right, engaging men is critical. So there are some wonderful programs out there that we have heard about in the last couple of days. Male Champions of Change is one example. And we're quite interested to see how might we be able to replicate some of these in different countries in which the Global Compact is around the world.
Some of the speakers here were from some amazing countries that are very active in this area.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that's so exciting about the Women's Empowerment Principles is how universal they are, how they really resonate all around the world, whether it's Japan, whether it's Brazil, whether it's here in the United States, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in Switzerland, whether it's in China. It really is a global agenda, and while the specific dimensions and issues might vary from country to country, nevertheless having some universal statement of principles that do resonate in each country, and then you can work out the concrete practical actions that are relevant for your country and context. It seems to be something that really adds value to companies and civil society working with them alike.
And of course it's an initiative that is in effect a partnership between the Global Compact and UN Women.
Absolutely. It's really an agenda for all. I mean, like you were saying, it's an agenda for women, it's an agenda for men, it's for governments, business, civil society. Really, we all need to work together if we're going to get over this next hump, to have the second wave of the revolution. So I would want to have a positive, empowering, supportive message to women entering the workforce.
That is an empowering message. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We'd like to thank the United Nations Global Compact and the United Nations Women for having us here to report this program. And thank you for joining us. Join us again for the next edition of Business in Society.
This has been a co-presentation by Prime, Principles for Responsible Management Education and Business in Society. For more information, go to businessinSociety.net.